Every family has its secrets, but few are so skillfully hidden, so lingering in the background, that only the sharpest eyes would ever notice something amiss. In the stillness of an old parlor, on a crisp autumn day in 1910, the Wexler family gathers for a portrait that will outlive them all. Heavy velvet curtains block the midday sun, casting soft shadows over ornate rugs and polished mahogany furniture, all typical in upper-middle-class homes in New England. The father sits at the center, sturdy and proud, his wife beside him with a gentle, tentative smile. Their 3 children flank them, all scrubbed clean and dressed in their best Sunday clothes. The photographer instructs them to hold still, reminding the youngest not to fidget. The click of the shutter captures a moment that seems serene, timeless, the essence of familial harmony. Yet, if one glances past the impeccable posture and pressed garments, past the respectable facade, a peculiarity emerges. It's something almost imperceptible, noticed only by those who dare to question the surface. The father's eyes, deep set and shadowed, do not meet the lens. Instead, they seem misaligned, faintly glazed as though looking elsewhere, at something no one else can see. The portrait ends up displayed over the mantel for decades, regarded with nostalgia and pride by most. New visitors marvel at the family's dignity, at the formality of the era, but only a rare few linger on the father's face. Some children whisper about it, inventing rumors that lend the image a life of its own. Was it an accident of the camera? A trick of the light on an old glass plate? Or something more troubling beneath the surface? Something that would later unravel the family's legacy. As years pass and dust accumulates along the frame, the portrait remains a silent witness, its secrets reserved for those willing to look closer. The father, Thomas Wexler, was known in Boston's business circles as a man of principle, reserved but dependable. He owned a textile company that employed dozens, and his reputation was built on hard work and strict moral codes. Yet those who worked closely with him noticed small changes in the months before the portrait was taken. Distraction, sleepless nights, moments when he seemed lost in thought, staring at nothing. His wife Eleanor managed the household with quiet efficiency, a woman who understood that her role was to maintain appearances no matter the cost. She noticed the changes too, but never spoke of them. The eldest son, James, was 15 and already burdened with expectations of continuing the family business. The middle child, a daughter named Clara, was delicate and observant, often sketching in her journal. The youngest, a boy of 7 named William, was too young to understand the tension, but felt it in the silences that filled the house. The portrait session itself had been Eleanor's idea, a way to commemorate their prosperity, to create a tangible symbol of their success. But when the photograph was delivered weeks later, something felt wrong. The composition was perfect, the lighting professional, yet Thomas's eyes held a distant, hollow quality that seemed to pierce through the paper itself. Eleanor hid her discomfort, insisting the portrait be framed and displayed. It became a fixture in their home, watched over by guests and family alike, always prompting subtle questions that were never fully answered. The photograph would outlast them all, carrying its secret through generations, waiting for someone to finally understand what those eyes had truly seen. The weeks following the portrait's arrival brought a shift in the household's atmosphere, subtle at first but undeniable. Thomas Wexler grew more withdrawn, spending long hours in his study with the door locked. Eleanor tried to maintain normalcy, organizing tea parties and overseeing the children's education, but her smiles became strained, her movements mechanical. The servants whispered in the kitchen about the master's strange behavior, how he sometimes stood motionless in the hallway at night, staring at the portrait above the mantel as if locked in conversation with his own image. James noticed his father's distraction most acutely. During their weekly discussions about the textile business, Thomas would lose track of mid-sentence, his gaze drifting toward the window or settling on some invisible point in the distance. The boy felt the weight of responsibility growing heavier, sensing that something fundamental was shifting in the family's foundation. Clara, meanwhile, began sketching the portrait obsessively in her journal, trying to capture what disturbed her about it. In her drawings, she exaggerated the father's eyes, making them larger, more haunted, as if her art could reveal what the photograph concealed. William, the youngest, developed nightmares. He would wake crying, unable to explain what frightened him, only that the man in the picture wasn't entirely his father. Eleanor dismissed these fears as childish imagination, but privately she shared them. She had begun to dread walking past the mantel, feeling those glazed eyes following her movements. The portrait had become an unwelcome presence in the house, yet removing it felt impossible. What would people say? What questions would it raise? In Boston social circles, the Wexlers maintained their standing, but cracks were beginning to show. At a dinner party in late October, a guest commented on the portrait's striking quality, then paused, studying Thomas's face more closely. An uncomfortable silence followed before Eleanor smoothly changed the subject, but the seed of curiosity had been planted. Other guests began to notice, to wonder, to speculate in hushed conversations after leaving the Wexler home. The father's distant gaze in the portrait became a topic of parlor gossip, transformed from a photographic oddity into something more sinister through repetition and imagination. Thomas himself seemed unaware of the growing concern, or perhaps he was too consumed by his own internal struggles to notice. His business began to suffer from neglect. Contracts went unsigned, meetings were missed, and his partners grew concerned. One evening in early November, James found his father standing before the portrait in the dark, the only light coming from the dying fire in the hearth. When the boy called out, Thomas didn't respond immediately, as if returning from a great distance. His explanation, when it finally came, was vague and unsatisfying. He had simply been lost in thought. But James saw something in his father's expression that night, a recognition or understanding that seemed both terrible and inevitable. The portrait hung in silent judgment, its secret still locked behind those misaligned eyes, waiting for the moment it would finally be understood. Winter arrived early that year, covering Boston in a blanket of snow that muffled the city's usual noise. Inside the Wexler household, the silence grew deeper, more oppressive. Thomas's condition, for it had become clear that something was indeed wrong, continued to deteriorate. He stopped going to the office entirely, leaving the textile business in the uncertain hands of his partners. Eleanor maintained the pretense of normalcy for as long as possible, explaining to concerned friends that her husband was suffering from exhaustion, nothing more. But privately, she was terrified. The portrait remained the focal point of the household's anxiety. It was impossible to ignore, positioned as it was in the main parlor where all visitors would see it. Eleanor considered having it moved to a less prominent location, but Thomas became agitated whenever she suggested it. The photograph had to stay where it was, he insisted, though he couldn't or wouldn't explain why. His attachment to the image seemed irrational, almost obsessive. He would spend hours studying it, particularly his own captured face, as if searching for answers in those troubled eyes. James took on more responsibility as his father withdrew, prematurely aged by the burden of managing both the family's public image and its private crisis. He was 17 now, tall and serious, forced to navigate conversations with business associates who asked delicate questions about his father's health. The boy learned to deflect with practiced ease, but the strain showed in the tightness around his eyes, the way his shoulders remained perpetually tense. At night, he would sit in his room and wonder what had broken his father, what invisible weight had proved too heavy to bear. Clara found her own way of coping through her art, her journal filled with increasingly disturbing sketches, not just of the portrait, but of fractured family scenes, empty rooms, shadows that seemed to have substance. She drew her father as a figure, slowly fading, becoming transparent, while the portrait version of him grew more solid, more real. In her teenage mind, she understood something the adults couldn't quite articulate, that the photograph had captured more than just an image. It had somehow preserved a moment of transformation, a threshold between before and after. William stopped having nightmares, but only because he refused to sleep in his room anymore. He insisted on staying with Clara, claiming her presence kept the bad dreams away. In truth, her room was on the opposite side of the house from the parlor, as far from the portrait as possible. The boy had become convinced that the eyes in the photograph could see him, that they watched and waited with malevolent patience. His mother dismissed this as childish fantasy, but she had begun sleeping poorly herself, often waking in the early hours with a sense of being observed. The servants noticed everything, of course. They saw how the family was unraveling, how the master of the house had become a ghost of himself. Some spoke of leaving, unwilling to remain in a household touched by whatever darkness had taken hold. Others stayed out of loyalty or necessity, but the atmosphere of dread was inescapable. The portrait hung in judgment over them all, its secret still locked behind those misaligned. Glazed eyes that seemed to know something terrible, something that could not be spoken aloud. By the time Christmas approached, the Wexler household had abandoned any pretense of celebration. Thomas rarely left his study, and when he did, he moved like a man walking underwater, slow and disconnected from his surroundings. Eleanor had stopped inviting guests, unable to maintain the fiction that everything was fine. The isolation was complete, the family sealed inside their own private crisis, while the city continued its holiday preparations outside their windows. Snow piled high against the house, creating a sense of being buried, cut off from the normal world. It was Clara who first discovered the letters. While searching for writing paper in her father's study, she found them tucked inside a locked drawer. The key carelessly left in place, as if Thomas no longer cared about maintaining secrets. The letters were old, dating back several years, written in a woman's hand. They spoke of love, of promises, of a future that could never be. Clara read them with growing horror, understanding that her father had carried on an affair, that the woman had died suddenly, and that he blamed himself for circumstances he couldn't control. The dates aligned with the change in his behavior, with the distant look that had appeared in his eyes months before the portrait was taken. The photograph, Clara realized, had captured a man already haunted by guilt and grief. The misaligned eyes weren't a camera trick or a supernatural phenomenon. They were the physical manifestation of a soul divided, unable to reconcile what he had done with what he had lost. Thomas had been looking at something beyond the camera that day because he was already somewhere else, trapped in memories and regrets that consumed him. The portrait hadn't created the problem. It had merely preserved the evidence for anyone perceptive enough to see it. Clara confronted her mother with the letters, expecting shock or tears. Instead, Eleanor simply nodded, her face composed, but infinitely weary. She had known about the affair, had discovered it shortly after the woman's death. The portrait session had been her attempt to restore normalcy, to create an image of family unity that might somehow make it real. But photographs can't change reality. They can only reflect it. And what the Wexler family portrait reflected was a man destroyed by guilt, a woman exhausted by maintaining appearances, and children caught in the wreckage of their parents' secrets. James was told the truth that evening. All three children gathered in Eleanor's sitting room while snow fell silently outside. Their father's business partners had sent word that the textile company was failing, that decisions needed to be made. Eleanor explained what had happened with quiet dignity, giving her children the facts they needed to understand their father's unraveling. James received the news with grim acceptance, Clara with a strange sense of relief at finally having answers, and William with the incomprehension of youth. The family that had seemed so perfect in the portrait was revealed as deeply flawed, held together by secrets and silence. Thomas Wexler would never fully recover from his breakdown. He would spend the rest of his life as a diminished version of himself, cared for by Eleanor with dutiful patience. The textile business was sold, the family's circumstances reduced but stable. The portrait remained above the mantel for several more years before Eleanor finally had it moved to the attic, unable to bear those haunted eyes any longer. But the photograph survived, passed down through generations, its story forgotten until only the image remained, a perfect family with one disturbing detail that hinted at the tragedy beneath the surface. The years following Thomas Wexler's breakdown were marked by a quiet erosion of the family's former status. The grand house on Commonwealth Avenue was sold, replaced by a modest brownstone in a less fashionable neighborhood. Eleanor managed their reduced circumstances with the same dignity she had once applied to hosting elaborate dinner parties, though now her efforts went towards stretching a limited household budget and maintaining appearances on nearly nothing. The children adapted in their own ways, each carrying the weight of their father's fall from grace differently. James, at 19, had taken a position as a clerk in a law office, abandoning any dreams of attending university. The textile business his father had built was gone, sold to creditors who dismantled it piece by piece. The young man worked long hours for modest pay, determined to support his family and restore some measure of stability. His youth had been stolen by responsibility, his face already showing the lines of premature aging. He rarely spoke of his father, maintaining a careful emotional distance from the man who had once been his model for success and integrity. Clara, now 17, had discovered a talent for illustration. She sold small sketches and watercolors to ladies' magazines, contributing what she could to the household finances. Her art had evolved from the dark, disturbing images of her adolescence into more commercial work. Flowers, domestic scenes, portraits of children. But in her private journal, she still drew the portrait, still tried to capture that haunted look in her father's eyes. The mystery of what had broken him remained a fixation, even as she understood the practical realities of his affair and its aftermath. William had grown into a quiet, serious boy of 12 who seemed older than his years. The nightmares of his childhood had faded, but he maintained a careful wariness around his father, as if afraid the man might shatter completely if handled too roughly. He excelled at school, finding refuge in books and mathematics, subjects that offered clear answers and predictable outcomes. The chaos of his early childhood had taught him to value order and control, shaping him into someone who would spend his life avoiding risk and uncertainty. Thomas himself existed in a twilight state, neither fully present nor entirely absent. He took short walks around the neighborhood, always accompanied by Eleanor or one of the children. He read newspapers and books, ate his meals, performed the basic functions of living, but there was a hollowness to his existence that everyone recognized, but no one discussed. The fire that had once animated him was extinguished, leaving only a shell that went through the motions of being human. He never spoke of his past, never explained what had driven him to the brink of madness. The portrait had been moved to the attic during the transition between houses, packed away with other remnants of their former life. Eleanor had been relieved to remove it from daily view, though she couldn't bring herself to destroy it. The photograph represented too much, not just her husband's breakdown, but the peak of their prosperity, the moment before everything fell apart. In the attic, wrapped in cloth and stored in a trunk, it waited in darkness, its secret preserved but hidden from view. The family tried to move forward, to build new lives from the wreckage of the old, but the past remained with them, heavy and inescapable. The portrait's haunted eyes had seen the truth long before anyone else, capturing the moment when Thomas Wexler began his long, slow dissolution. And though it was hidden now, its presence lingered over the family like a shadow that could never quite be dispelled, a reminder that some secrets leave marks too deep to ever fully heal. By 1918, the Great War had reshaped the world, and the Wexler family found itself caught in the wider currents of history. James, now 27, had been drafted and sent to France, where he served as a supply officer far from the front lines. His letters home were brief and carefully composed, revealing little of the horrors he witnessed or the fear he carried. Eleanor read each one multiple times, searching for reassurance that her son would return safely, while Thomas showed no reaction at all, as if unable to comprehend events beyond his own narrow existence. Clara had married a young accountant named Robert Hartley, a practical man whose steadiness appealed to her after a childhood of instability. They lived in a small apartment in Cambridge, where she continued her illustration work while managing a household. The marriage was companionable rather than passionate, built on mutual respect and shared goals rather than grand romance. Clara had seen what love could do to a person, how it could tear them apart from the inside, and she had chosen safety over intensity. Her husband knew nothing of the portrait or the family's history, and she preferred to keep it that way. William, at 17, was preparing to attend MIT on a scholarship earned through exceptional performance in mathematics and science. He would be the first in the family to receive a university education, a source of quiet pride for Eleanor and indifference from Thomas. The boy had grown tall and serious, his childhood trauma transforming into a rigid self-discipline that served him well academically, but left him emotionally isolated. He rarely visited his father, finding the man's vacant presence too disturbing to bear for long. Eleanor had aged considerably in the 8 years since the portrait was taken. Her hair had gone entirely grey, and her face bore the weight of constant worry and diminished circumstances. She still cared for Thomas with patient dedication, though love had long since been replaced by duty. Sometimes late at night, she wondered what her life might have been if she had left him after discovering the affair, if she had prioritized her own happiness over maintaining the fiction of family unity. But such thoughts led nowhere, and she had learned to focus on the practical demands of each day, rather than dwelling on what might have been. The portrait remained in the attic, forgotten by everyone except Clara, who sometimes thought about retrieving it. She had never told Robert about it, never explained the full story of her father's breakdown. The photograph had become a symbol of everything she wanted to leave behind: the instability, the secrets, the way appearances could mask such profound dysfunction. Yet she couldn't quite let go of it either, couldn't bring herself to destroy the only record of the moment when everything changed. The war ended in November of that year, and James returned home in early 1919, thinner and quieter than when he had left. He never spoke of what he had seen in France, adding his own silence to the family's collection of unspoken traumas. He resumed his position at the law office and moved into his own apartment, maintaining polite but distant relations with his family. The war had given him perspective. His father's breakdown seemed smaller somehow, less catastrophic when compared to the millions dead, and the world irrevocably changed. The family gathered for Christmas that year, a subdued affair with little celebration, but a sense of having survived. Thomas sat in his chair by the window, watching snow fall on the street below, while Eleanor served a modest meal and the children made careful conversation that avoided any subject of substance. They were held together by blood and habit rather than affection, bound by shared history, but unable to truly connect. The portrait in the attic remained a silent witness to their dysfunction, its preservation ensuring that future generations might someday discover the truth about the perfect family that had been anything but. The 1920s brought modest prosperity back to the Wexler family, though they would never again reach the heights of their former status. James had become a partner in his law firm, his wartime service and steady competence earning him respect and advancement. He married a schoolteacher named Margaret, a sensible woman who asked few questions about his family and accepted his emotional reserve without complaint. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and James proved to be a better father than his own had been, present, engaged, if perhaps a bit too controlling in his desire to provide stability. Clara and Robert had 3 children in quick succession, filling their small home with noise and chaos that Clara found both exhausting and oddly comforting. She had stopped doing illustration work after the first child was born, devoting herself entirely to motherhood. Sometimes she missed the creative outlet, but she told herself this was the better path, raising children who would grow up secure and loved, free from the kinds of secrets that had poisoned her own childhood. She rarely thought about the portrait anymore, though occasionally she would dream about those haunted eyes and wake with a sense of unease she couldn't quite shake. William had graduated from MIT with highest honors and taken a position at an engineering firm in Boston. At 24, he was already making a name for himself with innovative designs for industrial machinery. He had not married, showing little interest in romance or social connection beyond what was professionally necessary. His life was ordered, predictable, safe, everything his childhood had not been. He visited his mother dutifully once a month, spending exactly 1 hour in her company before excusing himself with some professional obligation that may or may not have been real. Thomas died in the winter of 1925, quietly and without drama, simply failing to wake one morning at the age of 58. His death was almost a relief, an end to the limbo he had existed in for 15 years. The funeral was small and sparsely attended, a reflection of how completely he had faded from public memory. Eleanor stood at the graveside with her children and grandchildren, feeling nothing in particular. Not grief, not relief, just a kind of numbness that had become her default state after decades of managing crisis and disappointment. The practical matters of settling his estate fell to James, who discovered that Thomas had left almost nothing, a small bank account and a few personal effects. While sorting through boxes in Eleanor's attic, James found the portrait, still wrapped in cloth and tucked away in the trunk where it had been placed years earlier. He unwrapped it carefully, studying his father's face in the photograph, so much younger, so troubled, frozen in that moment of dissolution. His siblings gathered around, and for the first time in years they spoke honestly about what had happened, about the affair and the breakdown and the years of silent endurance that had followed. They debated what to do with the portrait. Clara wanted to keep it as a family record, despite its painful associations. William argued for destroying it, seeing no value in preserving evidence of their father's weakness. James, ever the lawyer, suggested storing it properly with documentation of the family history, believing that future generations deserved to know the truth. In the end, they compromised. The portrait would be kept but not displayed, stored carefully with a letter explaining the circumstances behind that haunted gaze, ensuring that anyone who discovered it would understand what they were seeing. Eleanor said nothing during this discussion, simply watching her children navigate the legacy she had tried so hard to protect them from. The portrait had captured more than just an image. It had preserved a moment of transformation when their family's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. Now, with Thomas gone, perhaps they could finally move beyond it, though she suspected the damage went too deep for complete healing. Some wounds, she had learned, don't close. They just become part of who you are, shaping every choice and relationship that follows. The portrait would remain as evidence of that truth, a reminder that perfection is always an illusion, and that sometimes the most important secrets are written in the eyes of those who carry them. Decades passed, and the Wexler family portrait became a curiosity rather than a trauma, its painful origins fading into family mythology. By the 1960s, when James's granddaughter Sarah discovered it in her grandmother Margaret's attic, the story had been reduced to vague references about grandfather's troubles and difficult times. The letter that James and his siblings had carefully composed had been lost or misplaced, leaving only the photograph itself as evidence of something having gone terribly wrong in 1910. Sarah was a college student, studying art history, drawn to the portrait by its formal composition and the mysterious quality of the father's gaze. She brought it to her professor, who remarked on the photographic technique and the typical staging of early 20th century family portraits. But he too was struck by the father's eyes, that misaligned, distant look that seemed to pierce through the viewer. He suggested it might be displayed in a small exhibition of vernacular photography, anonymous family images, that revealed the hidden emotional truths behind formal compositions. The portrait was exhibited briefly at a Boston gallery in 1967, labeled simply as Unidentified Family circa 1910. Art students and critics studied it, writing papers about the tension between the composed formality of the pose and the barely perceptible signs of distress in the father's expression. Some theorized about photographic accidents, others about the psychological state of the subject. None knew the true story about Thomas Wexler's affair, his guilt-driven breakdown, the family's slow disintegration, and the decades of silence that followed. The photograph had become art, interpreted and reinterpreted without reference to the actual lives it had documented. Sarah eventually learned fragments of the truth from her aging great-uncle William, now in his 70s and finally willing to speak about the past. He told her about the affair, the breakdown, the portrait session that had captured his father at the moment of dissolution. He showed her some of Clara's old journals, filled with sketches and observations about the family's unraveling. Sarah wrote a paper about it for her senior thesis, examining how family secrets manifest in visual culture and how photographs can preserve evidence of trauma that goes unacknowledged in the historical record. After graduation, Sarah returned the portrait to the family, but by then most of the people who had lived through those events were gone. Clara had died in 1965, James in 1969, Eleanor years earlier, in 1952. Only William remained, and he viewed the portrait with the same wariness he had felt as a child, still disturbed by those haunted eyes, even after all these years. He told Sarah to keep it or dispose of it as she saw fit. He wanted nothing to do with it. The past, he insisted, should stay buried, but Sarah recognized the portrait's value as a historical document, a window into the hidden emotional lives of families in the early 20th century. She donated it to a museum of photography, where it was catalogued and preserved as part of a collection on American family life. The accompanying documentation included her thesis research, ensuring that future viewers would understand the story behind that haunted gaze. The photograph that had caused so much pain and confusion now served an educational purpose, teaching viewers about the gap between public image and private reality, about the ways trauma manifests and persists across generations. In the museum's climate-controlled storage, the portrait of the Wexler family waits alongside thousands of other images, each capturing a moment frozen in time. Visitors occasionally request to see it, drawn by the notation about the father's unusual expression. They study Thomas Wexler's face, trying to read the secrets in those misaligned eyes, and perhaps they think about their own family photographs, wondering what hidden truths might be preserved in images they've always taken at face value. The portrait endures, outliving everyone it depicted, its silent testimony to the complexity of human experience, preserved long after the pain has faded into history. What began as a family's attempt to create an image of perfection became instead a monument to imperfection, a reminder that every portrait tells a story, if only we look closely enough to see it. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.